but I would have coupled it with the other actions that we've taken since the new evidence emerged at the end of September 2010. And that is to immediately go and look at whatever we could find internally around the individuals involved, to immediately contact the police about what they about information that may be of great interest to them, to put in place the process, which took a little while, and we did it, I think, in the early part of 2011, around admitting liability to the civil litigants, putting a process in place to get to the bottom of what legitimate allegations there were, apologizing unreservedly to the victims of those illegal voicemail intercepts, which were absolutely inexcusable, and having a system of compensation there. So I think if I knew then what we know now, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can look at all these things, but if I knew then what we know now, we would have taken more action around that and moved faster to get to the bottom of these allegations.
Were the settlements paid by News International, News Corp, or News Group newspapers? I don't recall. I would imagine it was either News International or News Group newspapers. I think News Group newspapers, but I'm sure we can provide you with that information. What advice did Tom Crone and Colin Myler give you in relation to the payment to Gordon Taylor?
The advice from Mr. Myler and Mr. Crone was as I have described it, which was that the underlying fact in the case was a known fact, was a previous fact, had come up in the trial of Mr. Mulcair.
But were you aware the case involved the criminal act of phone hacking?
Pardon me, sorry?
Were you aware the case involved the criminal act of phone hacking?
That was my understanding, that was what the litigation was for, damages for the illegal voicemail interception.
So when did you get this advice?
This was in the first half of 2008.
In 2009, Mr. Crone and Mr. Myler informed us that they decided to settle Mr. Taylor's claim based upon the advice received from the company's external legal advisors. Was this advice received from Farrer & Co. solicitors?
Farrer & Co. has done work for us. I don't know precisely which external counsel they engaged on that, but I can clarify that.
Did you see the advice, whether it was from Farrer & Co. or from anyone else?
No, the advice that I had was oral from Mr. Myler and Mr. Crone.
And what was their advice?
It is as I described it.
Simply to settle.
And that outside legal advice had been taken with respect to the quantum of damages that were expected, that their advice was that the case would be lost, and that their advice was that in the absence of any new evidence, certainly no new evidence was made aware to me, in the absence of any new evidence from this was simply a matter that was to do with events that had come to the light in 2007 and the criminal trials before and before I was there, and that this was a matter in the past. And the police as well had closed their case and said there was no new evidence here. So the context of it was that it was about events that were a year or more old, about underlying activities prior to that, and that was where we were.
Was part of the advice given that the high payment would ensure the matter was kept confidential?
No, not at all. The confidential nature of an out-of-court settlement is a normal thing. I don't know of many out-of-court settlements that are not kept confidential. There are some, I'm sure, but so there was nothing about confidentiality. I think I understand where you're going with this, Mr. Sanders. But no, the amount paid and the advice there was resting on advice from outside counsel with respect to the amount that we would be expected to pay in damages, plus expenses and litigation costs.
Did you question why such high payments were made to Mr. Taylor and to Mr. Clifford? It suggested to be £700,000 and £1 million respectively for invasions of privacy, when the record amount of privacy damages awarded by a court remains £60,000, ironically against the News of the World.
Mr. Sanders, I did question the amount made, but not in relation to the 60,000. If you recall, as I'm sure you do, the chronology here, the settlement made with respect to the £60,000 against the News of the World, which I believe was the Mosley case, was after the authorization of the settlement and after the advice that we sought from senior distinguished outside counsel with respect to the quantum of damages that could be expected to pay, which in damages terms was £250,000 plus expenses, and litigation costs was expected to be between £500,000 and £1 million is my recollection of it. And I think that chronology is important. I think if it were afterwards, you would have obviously had maybe different information, but it wasn't afterwards, it was before.
You have since said that when you approved the Taylor settlement, you did not actually have all the facts. What do you know now that you did not know then?
As I've testified, Mr. Sanders, and respectfully, Mr. Chairman, the key facts, the key evidence that came to light at the end of 2010 as the lengthy due process of the civil litigations involving these matters took their course, it was that process that unearthed the key evidence there. And it was really only after that even that the police, that any said, you know, they should restart the investigation. As soon as we had that new information at the end of 2010, which indicated to us that there was a wider involvement, we acted on it immediately.
Tom Crone said last week he did not know why he left News Group newspapers. Can you clarify why he was asked to leave after 26 years of service?
Well, last week the News of the World, 2 weeks ago, I guess, the News of the World published its last paper. Mr. Crone was very involved with the News of the World matters over the years, and but the company believed, and the management of the company believed, that it was time to part ways. I was not involved in those direct discussions with Mr. Crone, and I can't comment on their nature or their content. I don't have knowledge of them.
Okay, final couple of questions. The New Statesman carries a story last week that News International subsidised Andy Coulson's wages after he left your employ. Can you shed any light on that?
I have no knowledge of Andy Coulson's wages after he left the company's employment.
And finally, are you familiar with the term willful blindness?
Mr. Sanders, would you care to elaborate?
It is a term that came up in the Enron scandal. And willful blindness is a legal term. It states that if there is knowledge that you could have had and should have had but chose not to have, you are still responsible.
Mr. Sanders, do you have a question? Respectfully, I don't know what you'd like me to say.
Whether you were aware.
I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of that particular phrase.
But now you are familiar with the term because I've explained it to you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders.
I have heard the phrase before, and we were not ever guilty of that.
Thank you. Philip Davis.
As you, I'm not sure if you acknowledged it at the start or not, but certainly the chairman did, that when we had our inquiry in 2009, the evidence given by News International executives was rather hopeless, really. They came with a game plan. Their game plan was to tell us that they didn't know anything, they couldn't remember anything, and they didn't know anybody who would know anything. And I just wonder, just so we can get off on a reasonable footing, what sort of coaching you've had today and who's advised you on how to handle this session and what their advice was?
With respect to today, after scheduling this appearance, we took some advice around what the context of this sort of a setting. It's my first time and my father's, I think, first time in a committee meeting like this. Mostly logistics and so on. What sort of questions we asked, but we were advised fundamentally to tell the truth and to come and be as open and transparent as possible. And that's my and my father's intent and intention. And we hope that we can show you that that's what's happening.
Mr. Murdoch Senior, you, in answer to some questions from Mr. Watson, seem to indicate that you had a rather hands-off approach to your company, that I think the point you made was that News of the World was less than 1% of your entire worldwide business, and so you wouldn't really be expected to know the ins and outs of what was going on. Could you just give us an illustration of how many times, how often you would speak to the editor of your newspapers, how often you'd speak to the editor of The Sun, for example, how often you'd speak to the editor of the News of the World?
Very seldom. Sometimes I would ring the editor of the News of the World on a Saturday night and say, have you got any news tonight? But it was just to keep in touch. I ring the editor of the Sunday Times nearly every Saturday. Not to influence what he has to say at all. And I'm very careful always to premise any remark I made to him saying, I'm just inquiring. I'm not really in touch. I've got to tell you that I spend, if there's an editor that I spend most time with, is with the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and because I'm in the same building. But to say that we're hands off is wrong. I work a 10 or 12-hour day, and I cannot tell you the multitude of issues that I have to handle every day. The News of the World, perhaps I lost sight of, maybe because it was so small in the general frame of our company, but we're doing a lot of other things too.
I understand that, but if I can help you out here, if somebody had told me that you would speak to something like the editor of The Sun, or at least daily and maybe twice a day, would you recognise that description, or would that be...
No.
You wouldn't historically, traditionally have spoken to the editor of The Sun on that number of times?
No.
No. Okay.
I'd like to, but no.
So, when you only speak, you said you speak to the editor of the News of the World, maybe on a Saturday night before the publication, not to influence what they have to say. I absolutely understand that. So, I'm just intrigued as to how these conversations go, because I would have imagined it would go something along the lines of, to the editor of the News of the World, anything to report, you know, anything interesting going on. The editor of the News of the World says, no, but a standard week. You know, we paid Gordon Taylor £600,000. Surely
He never said that last sentence.
Surely in your weekly conversations with the editor of the News of the World, something as big as that, paying somebody £1 million, paying somebody £700,000, surely you would have expected the editor of the News of the World just to drop it into the conversation at some point during your weekly chat.
No.
You wouldn't have expected them to say that to you?
No.
So what on earth?
Let me say, I didn't really call him weekly, but I would have called him at least once a month, I guess.
And what would you discuss with them? If things like that weren't on the agenda, what was on the agenda?
What's doing?
Sorry?
I'd say what's doing.
And what sort of response would you expect?
We might have to say we've got a great story exposing X or Y. Or he'd say, more likely, nothing special.
Okay. James, would you...
he might refer to the fact that there were how many extra pages they would have made into the football that week.
But he wouldn't tell you about £1 million payoff. It's just interesting to somebody like me.
He would expect other people to tell me that, if anyone was to.
James, would you acknowledge then, in your view, that you overpaid Max Clifford and Gordon Taylor?
Well, I can't speak to the arrangements with Mr. Clifford, as I don't have direct knowledge in terms of I wasn't involved in those pieces in that piece. With